So the growth in GDP actually tends to look like this. So this is monthly growth rates. And as you can see, it just changes all over the place. The average, if you try to put, well, where's the average growth rate in here? It's probably, somewhere around 1. So real GDP is growing by about 1% per year over the very long term. Something else you might notice if you look a bit more carefully at this sort of graph is that what's called the variance, meaning the spread. You tend to have higher variance means you tend to have very high values and very low values. So the average might be the same, but the results are spread out further. If you look back in the 60s and 70s, then there's a lot more variation. If you come down to today, in the 90s and 2000s, the band's a lot narrower. So have a look there. So the band tends to get narrower as we get to the right-hand side of the screen. That means, in some way, we must be doing better as economists over time, because we're not having the big booms and busts that we were in the 1960s and 1970s. If you look to the very far end of the screen, you can see that we tend to have pretty much the sameness. GDP might be 1 or 2 or percentage points, well, not percentage points, but 1/10 of percentage points higher or lower, but there's not big swings. So growth in GDP, in a sense, is what we're really interested in. So we're interested in making sure that the Australian economy is getting bigger over time because, well, honestly, there are more Australians over time. But voters tend to expect also that they'll have better quality lives in the future. And so that's also one of the focuses here, is how we can try to ensure that the economy is growing and also it's growing a bit faster. So there's ways we might think about that. We might want to think about raising the average rate of growth, so that would be, in a sense, increasing the slope of that line. So in the very long run, if we could increase the rate of growth, this line would go up faster. That would mean 10 years from now, we'd be a lot wealthier than we are today. We might imagine 10 years from now we will be wealthier, but if we get the growth rate up, we'd be even wealthier than that. Another thing we might want to do, though, is to lower the dispersion, lower the variance. With this graph, if we can try to avoid the really big booms and the really big busts. So the economy shrinking in the early 80s there, that was that big recession story. If we can try to avoid those sorts of things and try to have sort of a smoother growth rate for Australia. So just a bit of terminology that you need to know here. This is called a business cycle. So this is just sort of a stereotypical model of what happens in the economy over time. It doesn't always look as smooth as this. It's called a business cycle because it's meant to be a wave cycle, up and down like waves at the beach. They go up and down. And we tend to think that, at some points we're going to have really good times here in the business cycle, the peaks. At other points we'll tend to have really rough times, recessions. Those are called troughs here. But over time, the dotted line here represents, in a sense, the average, or what's called the trend line of growth in the economy. So the economy is growing over time, but some years we're doing worse than expected, and other years we're doing better. Again, think today, post-global financial crisis, versus pre-2007, 2008, back in 2006, when everything was looking really rosy.